Okay, so I'm going to talk about embodied meaning this morning. Embodied meaning has become an important part of the, middle way philosophy as it's developed. I see it as being central really to understanding the middle way, actually, increasingly. But it's probably not that well known. I mean, it's beginning to be more well known, perhaps, as an approach to things in philosophy, linguistics, psychology, so on. Yeah, and I think also, even when it is well known, its implications aren't very widely appreciated. So there's a lot of stuff one could potentially talk about here. I'll try and keep it as non-technical as possible, but also to give you an understanding of it, a basic understanding of it. Some of you have studied this before, so that will help. So, firstly, perhaps if I could try and give you an idea about why it's important, in practical terms, given this all has a practical emphasis in the end. I'd say there's two ways, positive and negative. Yeah. So, negatively, it helps us to understand what's problematic about metaphysics or fixed or dogmatic beliefs, and why that's a problem and how that comes about, really. But then the positive side is, I think that integrating meaning is an important part of practice, which can feed into other elements of practice. I'll try and explain what I mean by integrating meaning as we go on. So there's those two elements to it. So again, it'd be good to try and hold those in balance and not just get bogged down with one of them without the other. So yeah, just to think a little bit. I'll talk about this diagram in a minute, but I'll come back to it. But when you say the word meaning, very often people have two senses of the word meaning, or two widely used senses of meaning, which can be labelled as cognitive and emotive. So there's people tend to think in terms of cognitive meaning, which is sort of an equivalence. It's an equivalent, perhaps in one set of words for another set of words. Is that one form that can take? So you look up a word in a dictionary to find out what it means, and you find another set of words which help you to understand or interpret the first meaning. But if you ask an analytic philosopher about cognitive meaning, they'll say that it's the conditions in which a claim or a sentence or proposition would be true. So, yeah, that's broadly what's meant by cognitive meaning. It's about equivalences, and it's mental, it's abstract. Emotive meaning, though, as people normally use it, is, if we talk about an experience being meaningful, it makes an impression on us. We respond to it emotionally. Now, very often in normal talk about meaning, those two senses are separated. And the major thing I think embodied meaning does is challenge that separation, that dichotomy between cognitive and emotive forms of meaning. So the theory of embodied meaning, as it's developed, one of the central planks to that is there is really, certainly ultimately, no distinction between cognitive and emotive meaning. They are different aspects of the same process. Obviously, we can talk about them separately, but in doing so, we need to recognise that they are constantly interconnected and interdependent, and that we've also got into, I think, to a lot of habits in the Western world, particularly, we're in the habit of thinking of them separately, and that has all kinds of other effects on the way we think about things. I'd say particularly on the way we understand things like knowledge or ethics or values or what makes good practice or bad practice or whatever. All these seem to at least depend on the way we think about meaning. So the theory of embodied meaning, the two thinkers that are, I think most important in this respect are George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. And I've got a couple of their books here. Well, this is Mark Johnson's The Meaning of the Body, so if you want to look at a more academic understanding of that, you can find it in that book. There's a number of other books by Mark Johnson. There's a shorter book here called Metaphors We Live by Lakoff and Johnson, which again, if you're interested, you could look at. There are a number of other figures who've contributed in other ways to theory of embodied meaning. So the theory of embodied meaning really starts with the idea, well, we are embodied, so we are not just floating minds that are separate from our bodies. So our experience of what things mean, not just in an emotional sense, but also cognitively, the whole way we understand things depends on our bodies and the relationship between words or other meaningful things and our bodies. So to try and explain how this works a bit, maybe this diagram may help. I hope it might. So think in terms of embodiment to start with. So the little stick figure represents embodiment, the fact that we have bodies. Those bodies obviously include brains, so it's not that the body is something separate from the brain is integrated with the body and essential to its operation. In those bodies we have experiences from, or even before, birth. We start to have experiences, and particularly in the early years of life, those experiences are making a big impression on the way that we develop, particularly the way our brains develop. So broadly speaking, we could describe the impact of those experiences in terms of neural connections. So if I remember the figure correct, I think it's something like 3 to 5 trillion neural connections in an average adult brain is a rough estimate of an immense number of neural connections. And even in a child, there's an enormous, unimaginable number, really. So our brains are immensely complex, but they're formed by the experiences coming in. Now, one basic way of thinking about meaning is just in terms of those neural connections. So by making those neural connections, we gain increasingly adequate responses to the world around us. We get used to certain patterns of experience, we can recognise them again. Yeah, so whether it's the experience of a person or an object or something like that, we begin to recognise those things, so they're meaningful to us the next time round. Or it could be something very basic, like responses to light or to warmth or to a cuddle, or something like this for a young child. Creates new neural connections, and this is a very basic physical experience of meaning, and obviously animals will also have this kind of experience of meaning. Now, in the embodied approach, we then need to account not just obviously for this very basic kind of experience of meaning, but also the symbols that we use and regard as meaningful, particularly words and sentences and language. But the explanation is in effect not different. It's an extension of that basic process. So perhaps I'd better start also by clarifying what we mean by symbols. So a symbol, in the way I'm using it here, is a very broad term. It can mean anything to which we attach significance, that we recognise, that we make neural connections in relation to. So could start with significant objects, say. So you may not perhaps necessarily have used words in relation to a significant object, but you still recognise it. It's still significant for you. It's meaningful for you. So a tree you see every day, or something like this kind, may be significant for you. It may be significant not just in the sense you recognise it and think perhaps that's that sort of tree, but also the emotional impact it has on you as you recognise it, as you feel perhaps commonality with it in some way. or your physical relationship with you as you climb it or touch it or whatever. So there are all these kinds of significance which come to us through our bodies, not just through an abstract idea. Then there are sounds, and again, as we get into more complexity, music, so obviously sounds, we come to recognise sounds, we ascribe certain significance to sounds. Sometimes that significance is clear, sometimes it's very ambiguous and unclear. You hear a rumble downstairs at night, is it a burglar, whatever, you don't know. Visual images, so the meaning of art, for example, or artistic images, again, is not just a question of words we may use in relation to them. It's what experience, what meaning we ascribe to those images. And then words, and finally sentences. That's obviously where the theory of embodied meaning is perhaps concentrated most on showing how we can explain the meanings of words and sentences, of cognitive constructions about things we may believe, even using an embodied format. So you can think of the significance of all these things in terms of associations, and those associations are just a form of neural connection, most basically. So we've created associations which make us respond differently to those things as we go on and as we encounter them. But obviously symbols can act slightly differently to more direct experiences because they can begin to operate by themselves. They can begin to represent something which is not present. And they can also descend or rather ascend perhaps into levels of abstraction, which again, the theory of embodied meaning can account for. So, I'll try and give you a brief outline of how, particularly Lakoff and Johnson, explain this without going into a lot of detail. But again, if you're interested in this, better to read Lakoff and Johnson themselves, really, or indeed, there's more of an explanation in my book, Middle Way Philosophy 3, The Integration of Meaning, has summaries of this kind of stuff. So, basically, Lakoff and Johnson talk about schemas and basic level categories as when we start to use words, these are the first kind of level of meaning at which we begin to associate words with meaning. A schema is a kind of basic pattern of experience which we associate with a word or perhaps a group of closely associated basic words. A good basic example of a schema is a container schema. A container schema is based on the embodied experience of being inside something, or of one thing being inside another thing. Perhaps a child might learn about this schema by putting one brick inside a box or something like this. Yeah, so the brick is in the box, and that sort of understanding of in and what in means depends on the container schema. So this set of connections in our brains which allow us to recognise inness, if you like. And in the same way, then we can understand other kinds of words when we begin to encounter and use them. So, if we take the example of a field is basically an enclosed space of some kind. It could be a physical field with a cow in it, or it could be more abstractly an academic field or something like this, a field of interest. So this starts off as a schema. It starts off with a container schema, but it becomes more and more extended through metaphor. So what metaphor means there is just that we create a new association between the schema and some other context in which we can use that schema. So through the metaphor kind of links us back from this sort of abstract representation back to our embodied experience. So there's sort of even to understand something like the idea of an academic field, we still need that basic embodied experience of inness, obviously along with other experiences, to understand that concept. The other way in which Lakoff and Johnston explain embodied meaning, not just in terms of schemas, but also in terms of basic level categories, and that's just about labels for things, so it's mainly concerned with objects. So when we encounter and label objects, so we put them in categories. So, this is a chair, it's in the category of things we call chairs. Now, might well be, we can argue about this, but that a chair is a basic level category because, at least in our culture, we encounter chairs a lot. There are some cultures where they don't use chairs, or don't use them very much, so probably wouldn't be basic level in those. But something you encounter quite immediately in your experience and interact with is likely to form a basic level category. So it's a label for a type of thing which really you recognise because of your physical interaction with it, probably in early life. So another kind of example of a basic level category might be types of plant or animal. And Lakoff and Johnson suggest that again that depends on your context. So if you're perhaps brought up in a forest, perhaps you're a member of an Amazonian Indian tribe or something, brought up in the forest, then perhaps your basic level categories will be different types of trees, specific trees, because those different trees have a lot of immediate significance. The differences between them are important. But if you're brought up in a modern Western city, probably tree will do to start with. So we think basically of that thing out there as a tree, and then as we go on, as we grow up and begin to get a more complex, sophisticated, abstract relationship to things around us, we can start to make sub-categories or further categories within those basic level categories. So we start thinking oak, ash, alder, etc., rather than just tree. But again, how do we understand what an oak is? It's a kind of tree. We're going to go back to that more basic experience of a tree in order to understand an oak. And we've sort of laid down the embodied experience that enabled us to understand what an oak is at an early stage. So even then, if we're introduced in later life to some more extreme and perhaps barely recognisable form of tree, say a fern tree that only grows in the tropics or something like this, then...
Bronchial tree.
Sorry?
Bronchial tree.
A bronchial tree, yeah, that's a metaphorical extension of the idea of a tree, yeah. There's all kinds of stuff. If you look at metaphors we live by, there's loads of examples like that of metaphorical extensions of those categories. Okay, so that's just a brief introduction to how we could think about embodied meaning differently from the way it's traditionally been seen in Western thinking. Now, but then I did mention earlier that there's the negative side of this, which is recognising the drawbacks of the more traditional way of thinking about it. So I'll say a little bit more about that. So the term that I use for this is representationalism. So if we go back to the earlier on, I talked about cognitive and emotive understandings of meaning. Yeah. So a common way of understanding meaning in our culture is to see these two things as distinct, as entirely distinct, in fact, waterproofly distinct. Now, representationalism is basically the belief or the assumption that all meaning is basically cognitive. So although the emotive meaning may be recognised as some sort of subsidiary or secondary kind of meaning, it's not seen as really counting as meaning. So it's dealt with in another sort of way, which is usually given less importance. Perhaps, the most clear example of a representationalist kind of approach you can find in analytic philosophy, and the whole way in which philosophers, particularly in the UK and the US, tend to approach meaning, is to talk about meaning as truth conditions, which basically means that you understand what it is. It has to basically be a sentence of sentences, or a proposition is seen as the basic unit of meaning. So a proposition or a sentence, the meaning that you will understand the meaning of that sentence when you understand the conditions in which it will be true. So it's kind of as though you could identify that sentence. If it was true, you would be able to understand its meaning if you could perhaps imagine what circumstances it would be true or what circumstances it would not be true. So this very much links meaning to beliefs. In fact, it puts beliefs first, in a sense. So meaning is derived from belief. So this philosophical approach has started off by thinking about beliefs. So left hemisphere formations, if you think about the discussion we were having yesterday about the left brain and the right brain, and that the left brain tends to represent the world in a particular way that it can get stuck with or attached to. So the left brain forms beliefs about the world. So you could say, well, this is a left brain led way of thinking about meaning. That meaning consists in these representations created by the left brain.
Can you give us an example with a sentence?
Of a sentence, its meaning? Well, you could use any sentence.
Yeah. But why belief comes before meaning? And
in this way of thinking.
Yeah.
Well, if we take a very simple sentence, the book is on the table. Yeah. The truth conditions of the book on the table. For me to understand the sentence, the book is on the table, I would need to be able to identify its truth conditions. So that would mean to recognise whether or not the book was on the table. So if it wasn't clear to me what a book was, or what a table was, or what on meant, then I wouldn't be able to recognise whether or not there was a book on the table, or whether it was a flower pot instead, or whether the book was actually on a cushion, or whatever. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would be confused, in other words, about the meaning in these terms of that sentence. But I think actually this approach to meaning goes back way before the analytic philosophers who've analysed all this very precisely. So if you think about the attitude to meaning found, say, in the Old Testament, and the whole idea of laws revealed by God. So if God provides instructions which are true, or statements which are believed to be true because they come from God, then these statements in language which God has provided, these revelations, must in some way line up to the truth of the matter. They must represent the truth of the matter. So the meaning of those sentences must be entirely cognitive, must be understood in an entirely cognitive way. So thou shalt not commit adultery. If that is true, in some sense, because it's come from God, as traditional Christians and Jews, for example, tend to believe in relation to the book of Exodus, where that comes from, then you have to assume a cognitive understanding of, a purely cognitive understanding of meaning. Okay, so why is this a problem? I'd say because this whole way of understanding, if you take meaning to be entirely cognitive, then that's the basis of metaphysics. So in order to have a metaphysical belief, that is a belief that you can take, you've got that belief in words and you can take it to be true and you can be certain about it, you've also got to assume that those words can represent reality, that they can have a relationship with reality, a one-to-one relationship where those words map onto reality in some way. So that's one of the crucial features of a metaphysical belief, I think, whereby one can generally spot it, that it will build on that kind of assumption. So it will be created just in the sort of left hemisphere view of the world. So what tends to follow from that is, well, absoluteization. So I talked yesterday about absoluteization, that if you're, well, in terms of cognitive biases, for example, that we tend to get stuck with a particular kind of mistake in the way in which we interpret the world, by absolutizing it, by thinking that this is in some way the final answer, that it completely tells us the truth about the matter. So absoluteization is only possible if you have this kind of representational understanding of what the words we are using mean. So you have a set of words, and that set of words, to be absolutized, has to be assumed to be purely cognitive. If you take into account the emotive element, on the other hand, if you take into account basically that both cognitive and emotive meaning reside together and are interdependent in our bodies, then absolutization is pretty much impossible. To the extent that we recognise that, it becomes impossible to absolutize. We have to recognise that, okay, we have a representation. There's something that we think may be out in the world, and we've got something in our minds which we think represents it. But we can also hold that together with recognition that we're also emotional and physical beings, and we're never going to get more than a provisional representation which, for our purposes, might work in representing the world, rather than something that actually represents the world. So we're always, if we can possibly bear in mind that our meanings are embodied, that we don't actually have a purely cognitive representation of the world, that's part of the question, the practice, if you like, of the middle way, I think, of avoiding those metaphysical extremes. Another thing you tend to get with this representationalist approach is false dichotomies, or false dualisms, you might call them. Yes, so divisions between two things which are regarded as completely separate, as black and white, as on or off, as true or false. So false dichotomies are often based on what's in the representation that you believe in, or not in it. So the example that springs to mind easily for me with relation to this is the philosopher A.J. Ayer, who lived in the early 20th century, who's my kind of epitome of the arrogant philosopher, really. So he used to go on the radio and argue with Christian clerics and people, and he used to say when he was asked about religious and ethical claims that these are strictly meaningless. So they're strictly meaningless because he couldn't relate them to cognitive constructions and truth conditions and so on. Yeah? So you couldn't say exactly when a truth condition or a statement about God will be true or false, therefore it's meaningless, said A.J. And that for me is a false dichotomy, because it's not a question of whether they're meaningless. or not meaningless. It's meaning is something that we experience incrementally. We get more or less of it. It's on a sliding scale. Something is more or less meaningful to us, rather than being ultimately meaningful or meaningless. You may not experience something as being meaningful. That's because it's not got some connection with your brain and your body. But that doesn't mean that it isn't meaningful or in some final sense. Okay, so that's another kind of problem you get with representationalism, and another final one is for now anyway, is intolerance of ambiguity. So the representationalist view of the world tends to sort of crave a black and white understanding of things and intolerance of ambiguity is actually a recognised cognitive bias. That if people can't come to terms with the ambiguity of everything in our experience, then we're not going to be able to face up to that experience properly. So if you can't cope with ambiguity, well, there's two ways of trying to deal with that. You can either dismiss it and say, well, this is just rubbish, or you can kind of appropriate it. You can try and make that ambiguity part of the structure, the understanding that you have. But either way, you're not really just recognising the ambiguity as ambiguity. Okay. So the way I suggest that we approach metaphysical belief, so if you take something like God exists, would be a kind of classic metaphysical belief. Something that classically nobody can prove or disprove. This is the kind of thing that philosophers have argued about endlessly and largely uselessly. Now, what I'm going to suggest about statements like this is we should not take a statement like this to be meaningless, because there's no way, we don't have the kind of, divine perspective which would allow us to do that. We're embodied beings. At the same time, we don't have any justification to believe or to disbelieve such a statement. So I'm going to suggest that we should treat this as meaningful. It may be meaningful to varying extents. If you've never heard the word God before, it's not going to mean a great deal to you. But there are people, obviously, for whom this is a very meaningful statement. It connects with their experience in all sorts of ways. In that sense, it's meaningful. But you can't justify it within the terms of that experience. You can just assume it or not assume it. So it's not justified, and we need to separate that justification from the question of whether it's meaningful. Because it's not justified either for or against, either positively or negatively, then agnosticism is probably the best way of responding to claims like this. So, and by agnosticism I mean recognising that we can't ever really have a justified view on this. That you sort of go. So, and I think only that follows just from recognising that we're embodied beings, and that statements like this, they may have a connection via metaphors to our embodied experience, so they're not meaningless, but we can never provide a final justification for them of the kind that they would demand. Okay, I realise I'm running on a bit longer than I should have done here, but I do want to make some connections with practice before I finish talking about this topic. So, so meaning, being embodied is very much tied to our goals or our desires and our attention that we were discussing yesterday. and our beliefs. And we can't really work with our beliefs really without having meaning first. So the things that we consider that we might believe need to be meaningful in order for us to even begin to engage with them. So meaning is a kind of foundation or a condition by which we understand other things, by which we engage with the more complex possible beliefs, whether they're in science or religion or anything else. So one of the base points of practice, I think, is that we need to integrate meaning. So if we recognise that meaning is not always integrated, well, that's what I call fragmentation of meaning. Well, you could just call it the lack of integration of meaning if you want, yeah? So meaning is fragmented because, well, we don't always understand each other. We don't always understand ourselves at different times. We don't understand our own unconscious. John was talking about his dreams earlier. You know, do we understand our dreams? Well, often not. There are all kinds of contexts of fragmentation of meaning. We may misunderstand each other. We may not even listen to each other because we don't find each other's utterances meaningful. I suppose at one extreme, we may listen to someone speaking in a foreign language and not understand them. Or, you know, at the other extreme, we may perfectly well understand cognitively the words that someone else is using, but it still doesn't compute, or we don't relate to it in some way. So you could have for example, safety announcements at the beginning of a flight, and if you've been on lots of flights before, it's just a load of bureaucratic stuff, and you just let it go over your head. And it doesn't mean anything, in a sense. So if I don't relate to something in some way, if I don't find it meaningful, whether cognitively or emotively, it's fragmented, it's separated, it's shut off in some way. So perhaps the key thing about fragmentation of meaning is we need to recognise it has both cognitive and emotive elements, and they're constantly interrelated. There may be more emphasis on one than another, you know. So if I understand the words someone's using, that's primarily cognitive. If I just don't relate to what they're saying, or don't listen to them, then that's primarily emotive. And the same can apply within myself. If I don't recognise what's going on for me, it may just be those other ways in which parts of me want to express themselves are just not, you know, I'm not relating to them for some way, either cognitively or emotively. So how do we deal with this? Well, the practice of integrating meaning. Now, the practice of integrating meaning, I think, involves basically setting up more neural links in the end. So it's creating weak neural links, ones that provide the potential to make a connection in the future. So we don't necessarily have the strong neural connects which are required for believing something, having a stronger position that we then act on. If we at least understand it, it means something to us. If, for example, we look at a picture and it makes some impression on us and think, oh yeah, that's nice, or something like that. Even if we don't immediately go away and have our lives transformed by it, that's still created some links for us. It begins to be meaningful for us. So the cultivation of integration of meaning, I think, is more about that. It's about extending what we can appreciate and engage with, so that we can engage with the world more effectively on the whole. So just for reasonably quickly, there are just a whole number of ways we can do that. Obviously, education, I think, contributes to this a lot because it provides us all with a starting point of understanding the world and just understanding different ways of talking about or representing the world. And a particular aspect of education that is quite relevant here, I think, particularly as foreign languages, in that challenges you, well, to appreciate meaning in rather different ways to the ones we're accustomed to. But the arts are also crucial here, and the arts are great for setting up lots of new weak neural links. So I appreciate other ways of thinking about the world through the imagination. So the imagination is basically new weak ways of understanding the world, possible ways I could engage with it. And then, as always, meditation. There are some forms of meditation that I think more directly work with meaning. So, how many of you have done some kind of loving kindness practice or metta bhavana? Several people, yeah, most of you. So that involves, I think, reflecting on the meaning of people, or kind of extending what people mean to you, so that it opens the possibility of a more compassionate or loving response to what they mean to us. So there are some forms of meditation that work more directly with meaning, than others. There's the practice of focusing, which Nora's provided a book about here. If anyone wants to look at it. So Eugene Gendling has developed a whole practice which can be used therapeutically, or it can be used by individuals as an individual practice, working basically with embodied experience and sort of recognizing meanings that we might not have spotted in our own experience. Finally, I think just listening, actually. So in day-to-day practice of the extension of meaning or integration of meaning, just pressing on a little bit further from what we might have previously done, being aware of the limitations of what we can listen to or how we listen, or indeed looking in some cases, or reading, and might also be part of this. But appreciation through listening perhaps is the crucial thing there. Anyway, as I press too much on your listening abilities, I better stop there. I'm sorry if that's run over half an hour, hasn't it? But it is a particularly complex topic to get across, so that's my excuse. I suspect there's probably holes in what I've said which will need filling. But anyway, let's see what your ideas and responses or questions might be.
What I was thinking, I know we would hope that there'd be a synthesis or more of a connection between cognitive and emotive. But will Lakoff's ideas take off, do you think? That once we learn more about how the brain works and our biology and how we bodily express things. Because it seems that representationalism, and you've helped me a lot with this word, I mean, how can people still only think cognitively and not think emotively?
I think because it's deeply entrenched in academic life particularly,
right,
and in our culture generally.
Right.
So it's just going to take a long time for people to think differently, and even to work out the implications of doing so. That's the big thing, I think. So I think there are some people who have adopted embodied meaning in a superficial sense, but they've actually appropriated it to prior ways of thinking, rather than thinking through what the full implications of this and how does it challenge our understanding of things.
Well, it would be very challenging for some people.
It is very challenging, yeah.
Well, the whole culture, as you say, is our attention is focused purely on, screens, etc., purely in an abstracted world, isn't it?
Yep.
We're totally in our head and not aware of the effects it's having on our body or on our right brain or whatever.
Yeah.
So, we're more conditioned. It's not just in academics.
Indeed, yeah. But obviously our education, the way our education works often doesn't help here, particularly at higher levels perhaps.
I think Descartes played a big part in that separation between mind and body. And there was an interesting book came out in I think it was the 70s or the 80s by Antonio de Damasio called Descartes' Error, where they did these studies of people that, for either through a lesion or whatever, the emotional part in their brain was knocked out, but their logical faculties were fine. But these people all lived very chaotic, random lives because they couldn't set goals. They did not know what to want, and they didn't know what other people wanted either. And so this idea, this Spock being the logical one, and Kirk being the emotional one, is as Ed Catmull said in that interview, is a conceit that we our society very much buys into, really, still.
I mean, it's a way the brain is wired up, because I'm thinking of Asperger's, they're very logical. And they have to learn how to respond to emotion.
But even all of us are, society, scene, our culture pushes us towards this Asperger type of world, doesn't it? Where we're just using that part of our brain. And because you're saying ways to improve these neural links, I mean, it's how to pay attention, isn't it? If we attend to the to the right brain, then we will be aware of the embodiment of it, but we choose to attend to other things. And culture, advertisements, soap operas are all asking us to attend to one abstracted thing and taking us away from the possibility of attending to the embodied aspect of reality.
There's a very unhealthy objectification of the body as something that stinks. It has to be sprayed and washed down twice a day. It has to be prettified and beautified. And it is very fragile to infection and things in the environment. None of which, all of which are not very true. Maybe some sense in them, but on the whole, no. Grossly exaggerated, and that also, I think, is against embodiment. I mean, I think we ought to be more like cats, able to lick our own wounds, and which we used to be able to do.
Well, you say that, I find that kind of interesting, because at one stage to think, well, maybe it's going back to the Garden of Eden. We want to, get rid of the tree of knowledge, etc. We want to be back in that animalistic state of just living in the present moment, etc., etc., which seems very attractive. However, I suppose it goes back to the kind of metaphor of the fallen angel, etc. in the Garden of Eden. We did acquire this left brain faculty, and it's not a case of going back to being an animal. We can kind of be, in religious terms, what was saved or whatever. We can actually go back and reintegrate with the left side, as I think was said in that Master Hemisphere sort of book. It's not a case of just all becoming like dogs or cats, which, although they live in the Garden of Eden, in effect, but we can go beyond that. We can reintegrate.
Just like Woody Allen said that his brain is his second favourite organ. Even McGilchrist said his left hemisphere is his second favourite hemisphere. And I think you have to be careful not to demonise the left hemisphere.
Poor hemisphere.
We need it.
I think that the argument that's been put forward both by Robert and McGilchrist is that we just need to get them more in balance, really.
Particularly that the left hemisphere is essential for all our representations and understanding of the world, but it's just the idea that the left hemisphere has the whole picture at one particular moment that's the issue, not the left hemisphere itself.
You've spoken about things that we should do to encourage the connections. Is there anything we should stop doing to encourage the connections? I was lying in bed last night and thinking that rest is a part of, as an integrative strategy. Just to relax, just to lie and do nothing, or just to sit as you do, just look at the sky. Is there a faculty for integration that takes place where we're not actually actively encouraging it or pursuing it?
Well, in a sense, yes. I think we have some abilities which may not necessarily have to be cultivated for integration. I mean, one of the things about rest, I think, is that we can get obsessively caught into one cognitive model, so one kind of scheme or one metaphor about how things are, and that's, if you get into a kind of worry state or something like this, then I think that tends to be just developing one model, one picture of how things are, and your goals within that world you've created for yourself. But just being caught up in one cognitive model like that is, it's obviously fragmenting, but it's also works against creativity, and so the often noted phenomenon, I think for artists and thinkers and so on, that when you wake up in the morning, you might wake up with new ideas. That you can find yourself in or gain access to a new cognitive model when you've had a rest. Has a lot to it. I experienced that I can wake up in the morning and then find it easier to think in a slightly different way about something that I've been thinking about the previous day, and that's I think because in the state of sleep, actually all the different cognitive models, all the different meanings we have sloshing around, get more chance to exercise themselves, rather than just the dominant one.
It reminds me of before I came, I thought I'd better prepare for the retreat. So I hadn't been on a retreat like this before, so I thought I'd better look it up on Google. So I did Google how to prepare for the retreat, and there was bucket loads of stuff about how to put, what not to do, what not to take, what to take. But there was one that stood out, and it was a woman, and she said the best way to prepare for the retreat is not to prepare, just go. Which is what I did.
Right.
But not entirely adequate.
Could be a bit absolutising.
And there's nothing like just standing and staring. Some people just can't stand and stare. They have to be doing things all the time.
As long as you're not the man standing on outside park railings.
Yes.
I think one of the most powerful things I find about this thesis is that this switch that meaning comes before belief rather than belief comes before meaning. For example, I don't believe in fairies in an absolute way, but that's not to say I don't find fairy stories meaningful. or a piece of music it can be really meaningful, but it's not something I believe. And I can now understand that how certain traditions, how they, when you're going to move on to this with archetypes, that I don't have a God-shaped hole in my life personally, but I can understand now and empathise with people who are religious and for whom God is a meaningful experience. And I think some traditions do that better, like the Quakers, for example. They say, people have a concept or an idea of God rather than positing some absolute God that exists out there. And that's what I find really empowering about this theory, really.
That Yorkshire saying that there's 2 minutes for every hat, there's gods for all sorts of gods for all sorts of people.
I was wondering if sort of 2 possible impediments to people getting out of the sort of cognitive way of doing things is one probably fear-based, I would imagine, because if you've got a construction of the world being a certain way and certain things being true, and that gives you your sense of security and how to stay well and how to stay safe, then obviously it's very fear-inducing to have to confront the fact that perhaps it's not like that. So that's one thing. And the other thing that struck me was because of what you were sort of indicating about our lives these days, and everybody's so busy and there's so much information. So I wonder if it's also just a question of simplifying things, because we've got so much complexity and so much information to deal with that, again, if we have a sort of rigid belief structure that we can stick to that makes life work, then we perhaps are reluctant to switch out of that because that's simple and it's hard work to engage with something else and have to readjust our way of thinking and doing things.
Yeah.
But that is addictive, isn't it? The whole left brain modern technology, it is addictive, and it's this sort of hedonistic treadmill you get onto, and you're just striving all the time to be more and more stimulated. And it's hard to break out of that, isn't it? Unless you make a conscious effort to redirect your attention.
Yeah.
But some of that could all help with improving your weak neural links there. So foreign languages could be improved by using that technology. Like looking at the arts could be improved by using that technology as well.
McGilchrist calls the left hemisphere the Berlusconi of the brain because it controls all the media.
Does it do all the things that Berlusconi's supposed to do?
What is the point of making it? It's a bit like a hall of mirrors that we're in, because obviously language is mainly not the conceptual, abstract aspects of language are very much in the left brain, and so it's like a closed circuit in a way. It's a trap in a sense that you've got to make a conscious effort to break out of.
I suppose not just a trap, is actually addictive as well, I think. It's self-reinforcing.
But I think John had a good point though, in that if we think about the internet, we don't want to demonise the internet any more than we do the left brain, but that actually there are things stimulating to the right brain in the internet as well, and things that can be conducive to balance. And indeed, there's the Middle Way Society website.
I was just going to say one of the things that I found helpful to try and keep things balanced is, if I'm doing sort of very sort of cognitively demanding tasks at very left brain, I have learnt that having particularly certain types of music on or certain sounds seems to help balance that, and so I seem to be able to sustain the level of work and concentration for longer and with less impact, and I also don't feel I'm as inclined to get stuck in things. So that's I presume because the music is keeping my right brain engaged to some degree that perhaps it wouldn't be if I was just focused on more left brain tasks.
I think you possibly have to actually consciously attend to it, though, to a degree. It's like you're talking about listening. We can all listen and never really hear what the other person's saying, whereas because we're just listening with our left hemisphere and thinking what we're going to say next, whereas we actually listen with our right hemisphere as well, as you can actually do, then that is a different way of experiencing.
Yeah. And there's also, I don't know whether you've come across binaural beats that people use as a sort of sound and meditation type tool, which you generally listen through headphones, and they're different. They sort of engage the brain in different brainwave states, and I'm not very good at explaining it because I don't know the science of it, but basically you can use those to try and integrate the left and right hemispheres, and I found that very useful tool as well. Just to put on, listen to, you can feel the sort of sense of shifting as you listen.
Right, that's interesting. It would be interesting to see. Do you know if there's any kind of assessments of how well they work? For example, by psychologists or anything of that kind.
That I don't know. I'm sure there'll be stuff on the internet.
No, I've read that, although in theory it seems very plausible way to to affect these things, that actually it doesn't really have much other than a kind of a placebo type effect. But people do find it very helpful.
Yeah.
People find it helpful.
But maybe it's to do with the listening rather than having a specific effect. Sure. Then I don't know, but or as you said, placebo.
It's one of these biofeedback. Is this kind of a biofeedback type thing, isn't it? That you're listening to something and then you can regulate something by. I'd have to look it up.
Yeah, I don't know enough about it to be able to, but I just brought it up because I've sort of had some experience trying them out and found them helpful.
Good. So that sounds worth investigating.
Do other languages have different words for meaning in those two different senses then?
That I'm not sure about.
German's Bedeutung, isn't it? I think that's they only have one word. Sentido in Spanish.
Fred.
I mean, I'd be surprised.
Sentido, sentimiento. You've got. Sentimiento is more like feeling stroke meaning, whereas sentido is cognitive meaning, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I'd be surprised if most Western languages didn't make that distinction in some way, because that's part of Western philosophy and Western thinking. But how about African languages?
I don't know. I don't know many abstract words in Bemba, my wife's language. I don't. But there are two words in German, Bedeutung, which means it means significance, doesn't it? It means more what something signifies. And Meinung, which means an opinion or belief. Yeah. But, I mean, I'm not a linguist.
Because meaning, is that like an Anglo-Saxon word?
That's interesting. Because meaning might come from Meinung, because it seems like it's got a root there, but Meinung, as you say, has more of an association with belief rather than meaning.
Yeah, I mean, some analytic philosophers will tell you it's just a sort of linguistic accident that we have the same word for cognitive and emotive meaning. But if so, I think it's a fortuitous linguistic accident that might draw our attention to a relationship between them.